Every man has a dream. Every man has a fantasy. Every man has an image of the perfect woman.
When are you gonna get it?
What are you talking about?
It never occurred to you that picking girls solely on their looks may not be the best way to go about it?
But one man is about to get a whole new perspective.
Hal Larson, I'm going to do you a great favor.
Really?
From this moment on, whenever you meet someone in the future, you're only going to see the inner beauty.
What are you doing? I am rescuing you. From what? From what?
I gave them the ability to see the inner beauty, their heart, their soul.
He hypnotized you. You're saying that all the pretty girls I've met lately aren't really pretty.
Hal Larson is dating a vision only he can see.
Oh, there she is. There's Rosemary.
Where?
Right there.
Is she behind the rhino?
How many of you have seen the movie Hallowed Hal? Yeah. I know it's supposed to be a comedy, but I always think it's sad. I don't know. There's just something sad about it, you know. But it's good. It's good. It's really good. A really good message to it and all that kind of stuff. So let me ask you this question: how many of you have children? Okay. How many of you have at least one son? Or have had? Okay. All right. Then kids. Boys are cool, aren't they? I mean, they're a lot of fun to hang out with. They like to do dad kind of stuff, you know. Matter of fact, I bought my son a .22 rifle when he was 6 years old, and we've been shooting together for many years, you know, and we've run thousands and thousands of rounds of .22 ammo through those rifles. Had a really great time. So how many of you guys have at least one daughter, a girl in the family? Okay, we got a few. Man, daughters are awesome too, you know it. They really are. The only problem is, and I worried about this all the years that my daughter was growing up, the only problem is when they get old enough to where some hairy-legged boy wants to take them out on a date, it's like, yeah, no, you're not doing that to my little girl, you know. Why does some hairy-legged boy want to have a date with my cute little girl? You know, that just ain't going to happen. Today we're beginning a brand new series called Hallowed Hal. It's kind of a takeoff from the movie Hallowed Hal. And what we're going to be doing in this series, we're going to be taking a brutally honest look at some of the lives of some of the well-known saints of the Old Testament, as well as some of those who aren't so well-known, as a matter of fact. And what we're going to discover is that these Old Testament saints sometimes weren't anywhere near as saintly as they're made out to be, or as religion often likes to portray them as. And so what we're going to be doing is looking at those people and kind of taking a look at their lives and seeing what God has to say about them, as opposed to what their lives may have actually looked like and all those different kind of things. So it's kind of interesting. We're going to look at several different people. We're going to pick one per Sunday and kind of go from there for a while. But let me just welcome you to Grace Life here in El Paso, the El Paso campus. We're glad to have you with us today, as well as those who are joining us online around the United States, as well as literally all over the world. Even places like China and Russia and Japan and places like that. It's kind of interesting to see the people from different places in the world that are viewing us online. It's really good to have you with us today. We're glad that you decided to join us. So let me ask you this question. How many of you have a difficult time accepting some of the terrible things that the Old Testament saints did? Anybody have a problem with that? I mean, when you read through the Old Testament and you read about these people that we've heard about, maybe a lot of our lives or all of our lives if you're raised in a religious setting, you've heard about these people, and yet when you dig down in there and you find out who they are, you're going, no, wait a minute, something's wrong here, right? They just don't look near as saintly as what I've been taught that they are, or told that they are. I mean, if you look in the New Testament, you'll find that there's people like Lot who was called righteous. Matter of fact, God says he rescued righteous Lot, oppressed by the sensual conduct of unprincipled men, right? But you know, when you look at his story in the Old Testament, we're going to be doing that today. When you look at his story in the Old Testament, he doesn't look near so saintly. As a matter of fact, how many of you have a Saint Lot or have ever seen a Saint Lot on the dashboard of somebody's car? Think of it. Now, anybody wear a Saint Lot around your neck? No, and yet God says here in the New Testament, calls him righteous Lot, right? Well, he's a saint. He's an Old Testament saint. But because of the things that were so unpopular that he did, those kind of things, people, they don't, I don't think I've ever seen anybody consider him to be a saint. What about David, King David? He's another one of those guys that really is one of the guys that held up in highest esteem, I think, in a lot of places. And yet, you know, he shacked up with a neighbor's wife, and then when he thought it looked like he was going to get caught, he went and had her husband killed, right? And yet we find that God calls him righteous. As a matter of fact, God goes so far as to say that David was a man after my own heart. You go, wait a minute, you know, what's the discrepancy here? What's going on? How's come this can be? What's happening here? So the fact is, I was raised in a denomination where those Old Testament saints were taught to be saints. You know, that they were saints in the sense that they were basically sinless, that they didn't sin, that everything that they did was things that we should look up to and those kind of stuff. And even when you find places in the Old Testament where they did some really unsaintly stuff, you know, it wasn't that I was basically taught or maybe led to believe, whichever the case might be, maybe it was just my idea, I don't know, is that we weren't actually committing outright sin. It's just that we don't understand what God was doing when He led them to do such things, right? That even though it looked really bad to us, since God calls them righteous in the New Testament and maybe other places in the Bible, or like David, a man after God's own heart, that we get the idea that, well, then what they did really wasn't sin. God was just leading them to do that, and we don't understand what's going on there. The evil things that they did only, you know, just looked evil to the untrained eye, right? So here's my question. How in the world can a man who does evil things still be called righteous? How is that possible? I mean, how can God see some of the evil stuff that these people did and still say that they are righteous? Good question, right? I mean, how do you get around that? He didn't hide the fact. God doesn't hide the fact that these are the things they did, you know. It's written it's written in there. It's there. You can read about it. And we're going to be looking at some of that stuff. So today, like I said a moment ago, we're going to be looking at the story of Lot in the Old Testament and see if we can discover why God says that Lot was righteous and kind of look at some of those kind of things. So how many of you ever heard the story of Lot? Sodom and Gomorrah, maybe you know by that story, by that name. How many of you think that you would say that you kind of have an idea of what went on there, how the story goes? Okay, some of us do, I think. We've kind of got an idea of what was going on there as far as Lot was concerned and those kind of things. So the part that is most of us probably remember the best is the part where Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt. That's probably one of the things that we remember, maybe from our childhood, or maybe we read the story somewhere, who knows what. And the fact is, the Bible tells us that Lot and his wife and their two daughters were the only ones who escaped the total destruction that God brought upon Sodom and Gomorrah. Because Sodom and Gomorrah were evil cities. They just did evil stuff. However, the reason that God told them to leave and allowed them to escape this total destruction that was coming upon the city was because God said that Lot was a righteous man. As a matter of fact, this is extra, won't cost you nothing. Just prior to this, Abraham had begged God and said, "Listen, if you can find 100 righteous people over there where my nephew is, will you spare those cities?" And God said, "Yeah." And he finally got it down to I think 10 people, and God said, "Yeah, I will." Well, there wasn't even 10 people in those two cities that God could call righteous, and yet when you look at Lot's life, and you go, how can God call Lot any more righteous than what they were, right? I think you're going to see that here in a few minutes as we take a look at this story. So the story of Lot kind of begins, I'm going to begin here anyway, in this particular story. It kind of begins with a family feud. That's how he kind of ended up over in the Sodom and Gomorrah area of the country. So what happened is that Lot ended up being at odds with his uncle Abraham over grazing rights. How many of you have ever been involved or know anything about grazing rights? Yeah, well, lots of wars are started over grazing rights and water rights and those kinds of things. They have been in the past, and in some places they still are. It's still a serious thing. I mean, you don't have enough feed for your livestock, then you start fighting. You start wanting some better feed. So instead of starting an all-out range war between Abraham and Lot, which was uncle and nephew, Abraham decided to do the right thing. And what he did is he took Lot to the top of a mountain where they could see the entire ranch, from beginning to end. It must have been a pretty tall mountain because it was a huge area of country. And as they stood there viewing the ranch below them, Abraham said that he was going to split the ranch. They split it into two. Instead of starting a range war between his guys and their guys, he said, what we're going to do is we're going to split the ranch in two. You take one half, I'll take the other. Okay? And so Abraham, being a good guy, righteous man, what he did is that he gave Lot the first choice. He gave his nephew, of course, being the older man, I'm sure that had probably something to do with it. I think that most of us probably do that. Okay, you pick the best part. You pick the part that you want, right? So Lot did. As a matter of fact, Lot unashamedly proved how selfish that he really is, or really was, by choosing the half with the tallest grass and the best water. And he purposely chose the best half of the ranch instead of saying, let's split the other way, and I'll have half good and half bad, and you'll have half good and half bad. No, Lot said, no, I want the best half, and you can have the desert, okay? You can have whatever's left over. So here's what the Bible tells us. It said, Lot lifted up his eyes and saw the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Like the garden of the Lord. So it had to be really, really beautiful. It had to be tall, sweet grass, water everywhere, as it says. A really beautiful place, like the land of Egypt as it goes to Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward, thus they separated from each other. In other words, they each went their separate ways. Instead of starting this range war, or continuing the range war that already started, they went their separate ways and decided to live their separate lives and those kind of things. And it worked out pretty well, at least on the surface. On the other hand, you also need to know that Lot had some ulterior motives behind his choice. And you say, well, what other ulterior motives could he have? He already got the tallest grass and the most water. I mean, he already chose the best of the ranches, and he got the best there was. What other ulterior motive could there be other than, raising lots of livestock and living rich and living high on the hog and all those kind of things? Well, this didn't have just to do with grazing rights and the sweetest water, because the very next verse in the Bible tells us that Abraham settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. In other words, that's where he wanted to be, right? Now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord. Well, Lot knew that. Lot knew that. He'd already been there. That's part of the ranch, right? The ranch is half the size it used to be, but that's all part of the ranch. He'd been there. He knows what's there. He knew what's going on. And that's where he chose to live. He decided that's the place he wanted to be. So, just to maybe make a little conjecture possibly, but I think that Lot not only knew what the city of Sodom was like and Sodom and Gomorrah were like, but he enjoyed watching what goes on in the porn industry, and especially the homosexual part of it. He enjoyed that. He liked that, and he really kind of made no bones about it. He chose that half of the ranch, but he moved down there where it was. There was lots of other places he could have lived, and yet he chose that. Righteous Lot? Okay. So as the story continues then, we find Lot not only living in Sodom, right in the city of Sodom, but he's also made friends with everybody, become a very popular kind of person, and actually becomes an important government official. As a matter of fact, Genesis 19:1 tells us that Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. Now, what you need to understand here is sitting in the gate of Sodom is that was the place where business was conducted. That was a place of business. That's where they conducted their business in that day and time. That's where all the most important decisions were made. As a matter of fact, that also is the place where court was convened. So it was kind of like the city offices, you know, kind of like going downtown El Paso to the city offices, and most of your city offices are kind of localized downtown and that kind of stuff, and that's where business is conducted. That's where you get your title, transfers, and that's where if you have to go to court, that's where you go to court. That's all that stuff is down there. Well, in Sodom and Gomorrah, in those cities, in that day and time, that's where that kind of business was conducted, was there at the city gates. So it's very possible that Lot had gained such a standing in the city that he may have actually been a judge in the city of Sodom. The Bible doesn't exactly say that, but there's some indication there that he probably was even one of the judges there in the city of Sodom. So as we just read, one day a couple of angels arrived at the city. And it's toward evening. And they show up at the city, and the Bible tells us that when Lot saw them, that he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. Does Lot know who these angels are? He must. He must. He's a city official. He's way up there. Probably even a judge. Would a judge just bow to the ground to any old Tom, Dick, and Harry that showed up at the city gate or at City Hall? No. Matter of fact, when I go down there, they don't know who I am, and they look at me like I'm some thug off the street, you know? And they kind of treat you that way. At least I feel like they do. They probably don't. I'm just not used to all the security, you know, that goes into that stuff these days. It just, okay, whatever. It doesn't make me feel safe at all. It really doesn't. I don't care for it at all. So here's the angels. They show up at the city gates, and and Lot bows his face to the ground before them. He knows who they are. He knows exactly who they are, right? So what that tells me is that he obviously knew not only who they were, but what they were, that they were angels from God. So in verse 2 it says then, and he said, "Now behold, my lords, please turn aside into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise early and go on your way." They said, however, "No, but we shall spend the night in the square." Yet he urged them strongly, so that they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he prepared a feast for them and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, both young and old, all the people from every quarter, and they called to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may have relations with them." But Lot went out to them at the doorway and shut the door behind him and said, "Please, my brothers, do not act wickedly." Okay. Kind of the interesting stuff that's happening here. I think it's pretty clear, but let me just point it out that what you need to know is the fact that the reason the men wanted the men of the city wanted the angels to come out to them, it says right there so they could have relations with them. Now you need to know that these angels were men, and it says specifically the men of the city. So they were looking for something in particular, right? And I think we all know what they were looking for. They were looking for having homosexual relationships with these angels. Of course, Lot just wasn't going to stand for that. He wasn't going to let that happen to these angels. And so it says that he went out and he closed the door and he begged them, basically saying, "Don't do this, you know. Don't act wickedly in this way to these guys, you know." So as he steps out the door and tells them that, it really doesn't make any difference. But you know what? It looks like he's trying to do the right thing, right? I mean, he is. He's trying to do the right thing. He's one of the city officials. He steps out the door and he says, "Listen, this isn't a good thing, guys. You know who I am, and I know who you are, and you don't need me doing this. Can I talk you out of this? Isn't there some way that we can come to an agreement here and not so that this won't happen, right? So what happens next is really what I want you to see, because that's kind of where we're headed today, is taking a look at who Lot really was. How far he would go with being unrighteous and not being as righteous as what God says he was, right? At least not in our eyes. So what he did then, when the men of the city wouldn't leave, and when they wouldn't listen to reason, when he tried to talk them out of it, he tried everything he could to say, listen, this isn't what you want to do here. In his attempt to protect the angels of God, Lot decided to offer them something else to satisfy their lust. Okay? They were having a lustful fit, and they wanted something, and so Lot decided, instead of letting the angels go out there to protect the angels, he'd give them something else. And here's what Lot says. Check this out. Turn your stomach. Now behold, I have 2 daughters who have not had relations with man. What do we call that? A virgin. Okay, you might say I have 2 virgin daughters. Now that means they probably were young. And he says, please let me bring them out to you and do to them whatever you like. Are you sick yet? Only do nothing to these men, inasmuch as they have come under the shelter of my roof. That's his reasoning. That's his reasoning. He's protecting the angels, well, I guess I could say literally at all cost. How many of you would offer your daughter for that? Even for angels? No. I wouldn't either. Can you imagine? I can't. I can't imagine. Okay, different time. Good point, possibly. Because that's what a lot of times we like to think, is that, oh, it's a different time, a different place, there's different ideas, they had different ideas in their heads, different things going on. Well, number one is, does that sound very righteous to you? No, me neither. And again, I'm going to tell you that I was raised to kind of look at that and say, well, it doesn't look righteous, but it must have been, we don't understand it. We don't really know what's going on there, but it must have been righteous because God not only rescues them from these cities, but then in the New Testament, he gets a special commendation as being a righteous man. Right? I mean, is sparing these angels the indignity of what these men had in mind for them of greater value than the safety and the purity of his own 2 young virgin daughters? Well, if you want my opinion, no. If you want my honest opinion, hell no. However, there are those who say a modified yes, or a qualified yes. Because what they say is that women held a different position in society in that day and time. That here's the, I'm going to call them, I'll just say it right up here. Here's the excuses. Is that since women were not viewed in the higher way that we do them today, as being equals and all those kind of things, since women were more like slaves or servants of the household or whatever, then it really wasn't such a big deal for Lot to offer his own 2 virgin daughters. Well, I'm not sure I care about that. The Bible tells us about end times when people will even be without natural affections, right? Well, natural affection tells you a father that he wouldn't offer his own daughter for that. Right? So here's my question. Here's the basic question. Since when do angels need our protection? Angels need our protection? Aren't angels here as God's messengers for us? Don't they come direct? Don't we find angels all through the Old Testament doing all kinds of crazy stuff? You know, they're doing battle. They're wiping people out, all kinds of crazy stuff, right? Angels don't need no protection, especially our protection. We're not higher than them in that sense. As a matter of fact, verses 10 and 11 tells us that they reached out the door. These angels are the one that reached out the door and saved Lot's life. And they grabbed him and they pulled him inside. And in the process, they also struck the men of the city blind. So the Bible tells us that they wore themselves out trying to find the door because they were blind, couldn't see. The angels saved Lot, and yet Lot. The idea is, some people say, that Lot was trying to save them, this indignity, as though they couldn't handle it themselves. Right? The New Testament read where even Jesus says, no, when Peter tried to slice off the head of that soldier and got his ear instead. And he said, couldn't I call 10,000 angels to come and rescue? Of course. So the ideas and the excuses and the stuff that we give to Lot trying to make him look righteous doesn't help. I told you we were going to take a painfully honest look at this, and we are. I'm going to tell you straight up front, ain't nothing righteous about that. I don't care how you slice it. I don't care which way you look at it. I read one place where they said, oh no, Lot was doing the right thing by honoring. Because in that day and time, they honored their guests to the ultimate, so that you didn't ever do anything that would be of harm to your guests. I mean, they were your guests up to 3 days, and whatever it took, that's what you did for your guests. Well, that's cool. That's good. I think we would probably do the same thing if we had guests in our house. We'd do what we needed to do. We'd feed them. We'd take care of them. They want to go to movies. We'd take them to movies. They want to go to white sand. We'll haul over white sand. We do all that stuff, right? And so the idea was that Lot was trying to was being the perfect host. The perfect host. And that's why he did what he did by offering his daughters. So he did the right thing. Because he remained the perfect host. Well, in other words, trying to save his own reputation. At the expense of his own daughters? Nah. Hogwash. Or bovine excrement, or whatever. I really can't think of anything worse that Lot could have done. And I don't think God sees it any differently. Matter of fact, I know God does not see it ever any differently. So the question is, and the one we need to end with is, how in the world could God say that he rescued righteous Lot, oppressed by the sensual conduct of unprincipled men? Does he sound like a principled person to you? Well, maybe. Some misplaced principles. Seriously misplaced. I mean, after knowing what Lot tried to do to his own 2 daughters, his virgin daughters, and then yet God still says, righteous Lot, and still rescued him from the city and his wife and all those kind of things. Well, the answer is how God can call him righteous, even though he did all of these unrighteous things, is that salvation is not based on how righteous our actions are. And if you'll stop and think about that, I think you'll be glad. because I don't think any of us here are what we might call righteous in that sense. Because being righteous in God's sight is not about not sinning. That's not where righteousness comes from. I know we're taught that in religion, is that your righteousness comes from not sinning. That as long as you are not sinning, you are righteous. But you know, all through the New Testament, it tells us over and over and over again that no one is righteous by keeping the law. That if righteousness came, or if salvation came by righteousness, then we're not going to make it. It's not going to happen. As a matter of fact, that's what Paul says in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 9. He says, and not having a righteousness of my own derived from the law. In other words, not having a righteousness of my own, not being righteous because I do everything right. And Lot was not righteous because he did everything right, because he obviously didn't. And I think if we'll look at our own lives, I'm not pointing fingers, because I've got to point fingers, all the fingers at myself, that I'd have to say that my life is not righteous either, if that's what it's based on keeping the law and doing the right thing and never sinning and always doing what God wants you to do and not doing what God don't want you to do. I'm no more righteous than the next person. I ain't got no more chance of making it to heaven than anybody does. Not even Lot. Nor do any of us. But righteousness, not having righteousness of my own derived from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ. The righteousness which comes from God on the basis of faith. In other words, if righteousness is based on the things that we do and or don't do for God, then we're all in trouble. None of us are going to make it. All of us are in trouble. None of us will make it to heaven. So if righteousness is the quality of always being morally right and or justifiable, and always doing the good things that we know that we're supposed to do and not doing the things that we know we're not supposed to do, then none of us would ever be called righteous. And that's why the Bible tells us, it's a really good thing it does too, that God sees not as man sees, but God looks at the heart. Well, where does Jesus live? Where does the Holy Spirit live? Yeah. Because when he sees us, he sees Christ, not our unrighteousness. As a matter of fact, the Bible tells us that we don't have, well, he said, that's not a righteousness of my own. But Christ is our righteousness. He is the righteousness within us. We are the righteousness of God in him. How many other ways is there to say that? He is our righteousness, and we are the righteousness of God in him, not righteousness of our own. So when you look at Lot, and you look at some of these other Old Testament saints, and you say, they're not saints. You're right. Not in our eyes. But you know what? You're a saint too. You are. Because the righteousness you have within you is not a righteousness of your own. It's Jesus Christ who lives within you. It's his life within you that makes you righteous. It's his righteousness. And if we can get that through our thick skull, which it took me many, many years to get that through, is that, listen, I don't have to try to be pleasing and do all the right things and not do all the wrong things, because it's simply surrendering our lives to him and allowing him to live his life through us, because he is our righteousness, not us being righteous in him, but him being righteousness in us. God's awesome, people, I'm telling you. What we need to do is just simply relax a bit and say, listen, I know I'm not righteous. I know I'm a sinner. I know I sinned. I know I do things I'm not supposed to do. Yeah, we try really hard. Okay, cool, that's great. But you know what? Quit trying. And simply let the Holy Spirit live his life through you. Like Galatians tells us, walk by the Spirit, allow the Spirit to live his life through you, and you will not fulfill the lusts of the flesh, right? Why not? Well, because if he's living his life through you, he's not going to lead you in the paths of unrighteousness. Yeah. So, relax. Realize that the freedom we have in Jesus Christ is true freedom. That it's his righteousness within us that makes us righteous, not the things that we do and or don't do. And that's why the New Testament says, don't be pointing fingers at everybody else. We know that, we understand, we think we know that, and yet we may not know the truths behind it. God's awesome. God's awesome. And Jesus is the warrior of all warriors who has already fought and won that battle for us for sin. So that he is our righteousness, not our sinless selves, but his sinless self within us. Lord bless you all. Amen. Good God.